The morning sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. I stretched, the silence of the house greeting me once again. Jack's side of the bed was cold, as it often was these days. He had left before dawn for another one of his infamous business trips, leaving behind a faint scent of his cologne and a nagging emptiness in my chest. For years, I had grown accustomed to his absences, justifying them as sacrifices for the life we had built together, a life filled with luxuries, weekend getaways, and promises of an ever brighter future. Jack was the kind of man who could charm anyone. His presence was magnetic, his wit sharp, and his smile disarming. I had fallen for all of it, and for a time I believed I was the center of his world. But lately, things felt different. His smile had lost its warmth, and his touch had grown mechanical. The late-night phone calls, the sudden meetings, and the vague explanations were slowly eroding the foundation of trust between us. It started with small things I tried to ignore. The lipstick I found in his car was the first. It was a bold red shade, one I would never wear, and I had no recollection of buying it. When I confronted him, Jack shrugged it off with an easy excuse. "It must be Anna's," he said, mentioning his assistant. She borrowed my car last week to pick up supplies." His tone was so casual, so confident that I wanted to believe him. I told myself I was overthinking, that doubting him would only strain our marriage further. But once doubt takes root, it grows. I began to notice the small cracks in our carefully curated life, the nights he came home late, without explanation, the text messages he shielded from my view, and the way he seemed to avoid meeting my eyes when I asked how his day had been. Each instance was a pinprick, small enough to dismiss on its own, but together they became impossible to ignore. One day, while tidying the kitchen, I spotted his laptop on the counter. The screen was unlocked, and the temptation to look was overwhelming. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the trackpad, battling with myself over whether invading his privacy was justified. The decision was made for me when an email notification popped up. It was from a hotel booking service. My heart raced as I clicked it open. The message was brief but damning. A reservation for a luxury suite, check-in Friday night. Jack had told me he would be in Chicago for meetings. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. The details were clear, but the email didn't include another name. It didn't have to. The implications were enough. My hands shook as I closed the laptop, feeling a nauseating mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I told myself I could be wrong. There could be an explanation, but deep down, I knew the truth. That evening, Jack returned home as if nothing was amiss. He kissed my cheek, asked about my day, and sat at the dinner table with his usual composed demeanor. I watched him closely, searching for any sign of guilt or nervousness, but he was as smooth as ever. His phone buzzed on the table, and he quickly flipped it over, muttering something about work. My chest tightened as I forced myself to smile, pretending everything was fine. Over the next few days, I kept my suspicions to myself, unsure of what to do next. Confronting Jack without solid proof felt futile. He was skilled at deflecting and turning situations in his favor. I needed more than a hotel reservation if I wanted answers. The thought of hiring a private investigator crossed my mind, but the idea of someone else knowing about my unraveling marriage was too much to bear. Instead, I decided to handle it myself. I began paying closer attention to his habits, taking mental notes of inconsistencies. He had a way of being vague when pressed for details, but his phone, always by his side, seemed to hold the secrets he guarded so fiercely. One night as he slept, I mustered the courage to try and unlock it. My hands trembled as I reached for the device, but Jack stirred in his sleep and I quickly pulled back, my heart pounding in my ears. The risk felt too great, and I couldn't bring myself to try again. The following week, Jack left for another business trip. This time, his departure felt heavier, as if the weight of his lies lingered in the air after he walked out the door. I sat in the silence of our house, replaying every interaction, every suspicious moment, trying to piece together the full picture. The image that formed in my mind was one of betrayal, and it consumed me. By Saturday morning, I couldn't take the uncertainty any longer. I told myself I needed closure, even if it meant uncovering something I wasn't ready to face. With shaky hands, I packed a bag and drove to the hotel listed in the reservation email. The thought of confronting Jack terrified me, but I had to know the truth. The drive felt endless, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, the sight of his car in the parking lot confirmed my worst fears. My breath hitched as I parked a safe distance away, unsure of what to do next. Should I storm into the lobby and demand answers? Should I wait and catch him in the act? My chest tightened as I struggled to make a decision. Before I could gather my thoughts, the elevator doors opened and Jack stepped out, his arm draped around a woman I didn't recognize. My vision blurred as I watched them laughing and oblivious to the world around them. Her hand lingered on his chest as they walked toward the exit, and I felt a sharp pang of betrayal cut through me. Every justification I had clung to crumbled in an instant. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a coincidence. It was deliberate. It was real. I sank lower in my seat, tears streaming down my face as I watched them leave. The pain was suffocating, but beneath it, a spark of anger began to grow. Jack's betrayal wasn't just a blow to our marriage, it was an affront to everything I had sacrificed for him. As I sat there, grappling with the reality of his infidelity, a single thought began to take shape in my mind. I wouldn't let him get away with this. The drive home felt like a foggy blur, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. My chest heaved with a mix of fury and despair, the betrayal replaying in my mind like a relentless film reel. Jack and that woman, her laugh, her touch, the way they walked so casually out of that hotel together. It was as if I didn't exist, as if the years we'd spent together, the promises we'd made, were nothing but a distant, disposable memory to him. When I pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before me, quiet and still. Its once warm and inviting presence now felt cold, like a mausoleum of our dying relationship. I walked inside, the echo of my footsteps amplifying the emptiness around me. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and sat down, staring blankly at the refrigerator where Jack's favorite magnet from Paris mocked me. A token of a trip that now felt like a lie. That night, sleep didn't come. My mind was consumed with questions and the ever-growing flame of anger in my chest. I deserved answers, but more than that, I deserved justice. Jack had taken my trust, my love, and shattered it without a second thought. The betrayal wasn't just his infidelity. It was the deception, the audacity to build a life with me while entertaining another. He had underestimated me, thinking I would blindly accept his lies, but he was wrong. The next morning I woke with resolve. If Jack could betray me so effortlessly, I could play his game just as well. I didn't want to confront him yet. I wanted to be ready when I did. My mind churned with possibilities, a plan slowly forming as I considered every angle. If he thought he could walk away unscathed, I would ensure he realized the true weight of his actions. I started with his phone records. Jack, meticulous as ever, had a separate work phone, but he underestimated my resourcefulness. It wasn't hard to retrieve the billing statements, and soon I had a list of his frequent calls and messages. Most were business, but one number stood out: frequent, late-night calls, often during his trips. My heart raced as I copied the number, a bitter satisfaction coursing through me. I wasn't just the scorned wife anymore, I was becoming a strategist. Next came social media. I combed through his accounts with a precision I didn't know I possessed, piecing together fragments of his life I'd overlooked before. His tagged photos, check-ins, and connections painted a picture I hadn't wanted to see. There she was, the woman from the hotel. Her name was Christine, a younger, polished brunette with an air of confidence that screamed arrogance. She had a public profile littered with glimpses of Jack, the edge of his watch in a photo, a familiar tie in another. They weren't blatant, but to someone who knew him as intimately as I did, they were undeniable. Armed with this information, I began reaching out to my own network. I started with an old friend, Liam, a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in years. We'd once been close, too close, Jack had accused. But now I saw no harm in reigniting that connection. Liam listened intently as I told him everything, his voice calm yet laced with concern when he finally spoke. "If you want to make him pay," he said, "you need to be smart about this. Don't let emotions cloud your judgment." That advice became my mantra in the days that followed. I built my case against Jack meticulously, like a puzzle, each piece fitting perfectly into place. I discovered financial discrepancies, money withdrawn from our joint account and funneled into an untraceable fund. I hired a private investigator to confirm what I already knew, and the photos he brought back were damning. Jack and Christine, hand in hand at the same hotel I had seen them leave, her head resting on his shoulder in the lobby. Proof, irrefutable proof. Despite the swirling storm of emotions within me, I played the part of the oblivious wife flawlessly. When Jack returned from his business trip, I greeted him with a smile and dinner on the table, pretending to hang on his every word as he recounted fabricated meetings and deals. It was sickening, the way he lied so effortlessly, but I held my composure. His time would come. My revenge wouldn't be hasty. It would be deliberate, devastating, and deeply personal. For years I had stood by Jack, supporting his ambitions, sacrificing pieces of myself for the life we had built together. He had taken me for granted, but now he would see the woman he underestimated rise from the ashes he left behind. The first phase of my plan involved his professional life. Jack's career was his pride and joy, the cornerstone of his identity. Through careful manipulation and subtle sabotage, I began planting seeds of doubt among his colleagues. Anonymous tips about his questionable business practices and late-night activities spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before whispers of impropriety reached his superiors, and Jack's golden reputation began to tarnish. At home, I played the perfect wife, even as I watched his world begin to crumble. I took quiet satisfaction in his furrowed brow and distracted demeanor, knowing that his carefully constructed facade was cracking. He confided in me one night, his voice laced with frustration. "Work's been complicated lately," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know who's spreading these rumors, but it's affecting everything." I nodded sympathetically, offering a soft, "I'm sure it'll blow over," even as I reveled in his growing paranoia. The second phase was more personal. I reconnected with 3 men from my past, each of whom played a unique role in my life before Jack. Liam, of course, was the first. His legal expertise and unshakable loyalty were invaluable. Then there was Ethan, a former coworker whose charm and resourcefulness were unmatched. Lastly, I reached out to Marcus, an unexpected ally who had once been Jack's closest friend before their falling out years ago. Together, we formed a quiet coalition, each with a vested interest in exposing Jack for the man he truly was. As I orchestrated the final steps of my plan, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. The pain of Jack's betrayal had once consumed me, but now it fueled me, driving me forward with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my power. Jack had no idea what was coming. The morning after Jack's return felt like the calm before a storm. The house was unusually quiet, save for the occasional clinking of his coffee cup against the saucer. He read the paper, his brow furrowed, undoubtedly distracted by the recent chaos at work. It was almost poetic, how his lies were beginning to unravel one thread at a time. But Jack didn't suspect me. That was the brilliance of it. He had always underestimated my capacity for resilience, for action. I watched him from across the table, masking my contempt with a placid smile. He looked tired, worn, as though the weight of his double life was finally bearing down on him. "Rough night?" I asked, feigning concern. He looked up, startled, before offering a weak smile. "Just work stress," he replied, brushing it off like he always did. "Things'll smooth out soon." I nodded, sipping my coffee, though inwardly I was counting the ways his world would come crashing down. The foundation of his lies was already crumbling. All it needed was a decisive push, and I had just the plan. Later that day, I met Liam at a quiet cafe downtown. He was dressed impeccably as always, his sharp suit and confident demeanor exuding professionalism. Liam had always been a man of action, and his support was invaluable. He slid a folder across the table toward me, his expression serious. "These are the financial discrepancies you asked me to dig into," he said, lowering his voice. "Jack's been careful, but not careful enough. There's a trail leading directly to that account he's using to fund his extracurricular activities." Oh, I opened the folder, my stomach churning as I scanned the documents, transactions, hotel receipts, and even a jewelry purchase, all proof of Jack's betrayal. My fingers tightened around the folder as I closed it, my resolve hardening. "Thank you, Liam," I said quietly. "This will do perfectly." He leaned back, studying me with a mix of admiration and concern. "You're really going through with this, aren't you?" I met his gaze, unflinching. He destroyed my trust, my marriage. He doesn't get to walk away unscathed. That evening, I put the next part of my plan into action. While Jack sat in his study, engrossed in whatever fabricated report he was concocting, I texted Ethan. We had agreed to meet discreetly at a bar near his office. Ethan was a natural charmer, his quick wit and easy smile masking a shrewd mind. He'd been a close friend during my early career, and when I reached out to him, he didn't hesitate to offer his help. When I arrived, Ethan was already waiting, nursing a glass of whiskey. He greeted me with a warm smile, standing to pull out my chair. "You look great," he said, his tone sincere. "Flattery won't get you out of this," I teased, though the compliment was appreciated. I had dressed carefully, ensuring I exuded both confidence and control. We spoke in hushed tones, outlining the details of what I needed from him. Ethan's role was pivotal. He would subtly feed information about Jack's activities to the right people, ensuring it reached his professional circles. A tarnished reputation wasn't enough. I wanted Jack to feel the sting of alienation, to realize that his lies couldn't protect him forever. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowed. "This isn't just about exposing him, it's about what comes after." I nodded firmly. This isn't revenge for the sake of revenge. This is about making him understand the consequences of his actions. Ethan raised his glass in a silent toast, a wry smile on his lips. "Here's to justice, then." The days that followed were a whirlwind of calculated moves. Marcus, Jack's former friend, was surprisingly eager to assist. Their falling out had been bitter, and Marcus harbored his own grievances against Jack. He provided insights into Jack's weaknesses, giving me leverage I hadn't even realized I needed. With the pieces in place, the plan began to unfold. Anonymous tips about Jack's questionable behavior spread like wildfire through his office. The photos I had from the private investigator, Jack and Christine in compromising positions, found their way into the inboxes of his colleagues. Subtle but damning whispers about his integrity began circulating among his business contacts. It wasn't long before Jack started noticing the shift. At home, his demeanor changed. The confident, smooth-talking man I'd married was replaced by someone visibly on edge. He spent hours in his study, his phone glued to his ear, trying to do damage control. He was spiraling, and I took quiet satisfaction in watching him unravel. One evening, he finally brought it up, his voice laced with frustration. "There's something going on at work," he said, pacing the living room. "Someone's spreading lies about me." I feigned surprise, setting my book aside. "That's terrible. Do you know who it could be?" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I have no idea. It's like someone's out to get me." I fought the urge to smirk, instead offering a sympathetic nod. "I'm sure you'll figure it out. You always do." But Jack didn't figure it out. The walls of his carefully constructed life were closing in, and he was powerless to stop it. The climax came 2 weeks later, during a charity gala we attended together. Jack, ever the social butterfly, worked the room with his usual charm, but there was an underlying tension in his demeanor. He was trying too hard, his laughter too forced, his smiles too strained. Midway through the evening, Liam arrived, his entrance calculated and deliberate. He greeted me warmly, his presence catching Jack's attention immediately. The two men exchanged polite pleasantries, though the air between them was palpably tense. Jack knew Liam, and he knew what his presence meant. It was during the auction that the final blow was delivered. A series of slideshows showcasing the gala's sponsors began playing on the large screens scattered around the ballroom. Among them was a photo of Jack and Christine, one of the damning images I had strategically planted. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the image lingered for just a moment too long before being replaced by the next slide. Jack froze, his face paling as whispers spread around us. He turned to me, his eyes wide with panic. "What the hell is this?" he hissed. I met his gaze, my expression calm and composed. "I guess someone wanted the truth to come out." He stared at me, realization dawning in his eyes. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. I stood, smoothing my dress and picking up my clutch. "You'll excuse me, won't you? I suddenly feel the need for some fresh air." As I walked away, leaving him to face the fallout of his actions, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. And this wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my power, my life. Jack had taken me for granted, but now he would face the consequences of his choices. And as for me, I was finally free. The morning after the gala was eerily quiet. Jack hadn't come to bed, and when I walked into the living room, I found him sitting in the dark, his head in his hands. His usual air of confidence and control had crumbled, replaced by a man grappling with the weight of his downfall. For a fleeting moment, I felt pity, but it was quickly swallowed by the satisfaction of knowing he was finally reaping what he had sown. He looked up when he heard me enter, his eyes bloodshot and filled with desperation. "Why, Claire?" His voice cracked, and it was the first time I'd heard him sound vulnerable in years. "Why would you do this to me?" I stared at him, letting the silence hang between us for a moment before answering. "Why?" I repeated, my voice calm yet sharp. "Maybe you should ask yourself that question, Jack. Why would you betray me? Why would you throw away everything we built together for someone who will never understand you the way I did?" He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The excuses, the lies, they had lost their power. I wasn't the naive woman he had fooled for so long. I was someone he could no longer manipulate. "I never meant to hurt you," he finally muttered, his voice barely audible. I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the room. "You didn't mean to hurt me. Jack, you didn't care about me at all. You cared about yourself, about your ego, your needs. And now you're upset because the world finally sees you for what you are." He flinched at my words, and for the first time I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. But it wasn't enough, not after everything he had done. I walked past him, heading toward the kitchen to pour myself a cup of coffee. I needed the caffeine to focus on the next phase of my plan. While Jack was busy trying to salvage what was left of his reputation, I was already several steps ahead. The evidence I had gathered, the financial records, the photos, the testimonies, wasn't just meant to humiliate him. It was my insurance policy, ensuring he wouldn't be able to twist the narrative or retaliate. The next few days were a whirlwind of chaos for Jack. His colleagues distanced themselves, his boss called for an emergency meeting, and Christine, his so-called partner in crime, vanished the moment things started to unravel. She wasn't willing to risk her own career for a man whose foundation was crumbling beneath him. Jack was left isolated, struggling to hold onto the remnants of his once perfect image. Meanwhile, I had begun securing my own future. I contacted Marcus, who had proven to be an invaluable ally. He introduced me to a network of financial advisors and legal experts who helped me quietly extract my share of the assets Jack and I had accumulated over the years. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. One evening, as I sat in the living room reviewing documents, Jack stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "You're siphoning our money," he accused, his voice shaking with rage. "You're trying to ruin me." I didn't even look up. "Our money?" I asked, my tone icy. "You mean the money you used to fund your affair? The money you stole from me when you betrayed our marriage?" He stood there, fists clenched, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain his anger. But he knew he had no ground to stand on. Everything I had done was legal, calculated, and precise. He couldn't stop me, no matter how much he wanted to. "You've destroyed everything," he finally said, his voice breaking. "Our life, our future, everything." I looked at him then, meeting his gaze with a steely determination. "No, Jack. You destroyed everything the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. All I've done is ensure you face the consequences of your actions." With that, I stood and walked past him, my heart steady and unyielding. For years, I had been the dutiful wife, sacrificing my happiness for the sake of our marriage. But those days were over. I was no longer the woman who would shrink in his shadow. I was stronger, smarter, and ready to reclaim the life he had tried to take from me. The final blow came 2 weeks later. Jack received a letter from his employer informing him of his termination due to conduct that violated company policy. The whispers of his infidelity and financial improprieties had reached the board, and they had no choice but to let him go. He was officially a pariah, a man who had lost everything: his career, his reputation, and his marriage. I watched from the sidelines as he packed his belongings and left our house for the last time. He didn't say a word as he walked past me. His shoulders slumped, his once proud demeanor now reduced to a shell of the man he used to be. I felt no remorse as I closed the door behind him. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I found solace in the friendships I had rekindled and the new opportunities that came my way. Liam, ever the steady presence, became a confidant and partner in ways I hadn't expected. He reminded me that life wasn't over just because one part of it had come to an end. One evening, as we sat together on my newly renovated patio, Liam raised a glass to me, his eyes warm and proud. "To new beginnings," he said. I smiled, clinking my glass against his. "To freedom," I replied, the weight of the past finally lifting from my shoulders. Jack had thought he could shatter me, but he had only made me stronger. And as I looked out at the horizon, I realized that my life was no longer defined by his betrayal. It was mine to shape, and I intended to make the most of it. The following weeks felt like walking through a battlefield after the dust had settled. Jack was no longer the man I'd built my life around. He was a phantom, haunting the corners of the house as he struggled to piece together the remains of his world. Every conversation was clipped, every glance filled with tension. But it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't looking for resolution. I was crafting closure on my terms. Jack spent most of his time in the study, on the phone, trying to salvage his career. The company had made their decision, though, and no amount of pleading could undo it. The photographs, the rumors, and the quiet accusations had spread like wildfire. By the time he realized the extent of the damage, it was too late. His colleagues had distanced themselves, his once loyal clients were taking their business elsewhere, and his professional reputation, his most prized possession, was irrevocably tarnished. I watched him unravel in silence, letting the weight of his choices sink in. He still didn't know the full extent of my involvement, but he must have suspected. There was a growing bitterness in his demeanor, a quiet anger he barely masked. One evening, he confronted me in the kitchen, his voice cold and accusatory. "You've been meddling, haven't you?" His eyes bore into mine, searching for confirmation. I turned to face him, my expression calm. "Meddling?" I repeated, feigning ignorance. "I'm not the one who destroyed our marriage, Jack. You did that all on your own." His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked as though he might lash out. But he didn't. He simply stared at me, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. Without another word, he turned and left the room. That was the moment I knew I had won. But I wasn't finished yet. There was one final piece to the puzzle, one last act to ensure Jack truly understood the consequences of his actions. With Liam's help, I had begun the process of dividing our assets and preparing for a divorce. But I wanted more than just a legal separation. I wanted him to feel the loss on every level. The house was my starting point. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of the life we had built together. I knew Jack wouldn't fight me for it. He didn't have the financial means anymore, and his pride wouldn't allow him to beg. As the paperwork moved forward, I began making changes. I replaced the furniture, painted the walls, and filled the space with pieces that reflected my own tastes. The house became a sanctuary, a reflection of the woman I was becoming, a woman free from his shadow. Next, I turned my attention to the people who had enabled him. Christine, his affair partner, hadn't escaped unscathed. The same evidence I had used against Jack had been shared with her employer, and she had been quietly let go. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, but I didn't feel sympathy either. She had known he was married, and she had made her choices. Then there was Marcus, who proved instrumental in ensuring Jack's social circle was no longer a safe haven. With his connections and insight into Jack's past, Marcus subtly spread the truth about Jack's duplicity. By the time Jack tried to reach out to old friends, most of them had already distanced themselves. He was alone, isolated, and forced to face the wreckage of his life without the support he had once taken for granted. One afternoon, as I sat in my newly redecorated living room, Jack came home earlier than usual. He looked exhausted, his suit rumpled and his tie askew. He dropped his briefcase by the door and sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I lost the apartment," he said after a long silence, his voice hollow. "I can't afford it anymore." I didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Finally, I spoke, my tone measured. "You can stay here, for now." His head shot up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Really?" I nodded. "But only until the divorce is finalized. After that, you're on your own." He didn't thank me. He just nodded, his shoulders slumping even further. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity, but it quickly passed. This was the bed he had made, and now he had to lie in it. The days that followed were marked by a quiet tension. Jack stayed out of my way, retreating to the guest room and avoiding conversation. I focused on myself, pouring my energy into work, friends, and the small joys I had rediscovered. It wasn't easy, but each step forward felt like a victory. One evening, as I sat on the patio with a glass of wine, Liam joined me. He had become a steady presence in my life, offering support and encouragement without judgment. We talked about everything: work, life, and the future. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice warm. "You should be proud of yourself." I smiled, the weight of his words sinking in. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shrugged, his expression soft. "You had it in you all along. You just needed to see it." As we clinked our glasses, I realized he was right. Jack's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been a turning point. It had forced me to confront the truth about myself, my marriage, and the life I wanted to live. And while the journey had been painful, it had also been transformative. When the divorce was finalized, Jack packed his belongings and left for good. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation, just a quiet end to a chapter that had defined so much of my life. As I watched his car disappear down the driveway, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I was free. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild. The scars of Jack's betrayal would always be there, but they no longer defined me. I had learned to stand on my own, to find strength in my own resilience. And as I looked toward the future, I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The house was quiet as I stood in the living room, gazing out the window at the fading sunset. The papers were signed, the ink dry, and Jack's car was gone for good. The weight of it all began to lift. The years of lies, the betrayal, the anger. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe deeply, unburdened. The silence that once felt oppressive now felt peaceful, a canvas for a new beginning. I walked to the patio, clutching a glass of wine. The night air was cool, the stars just beginning to twinkle in the clear sky. It felt surreal to finally be on the other side of everything, to know I had survived. More than that, I had reclaimed myself. I wasn't just Jack's wife, the woman he betrayed and underestimated. I was Claire, a woman who had faced the storm and come out stronger. Liam arrived shortly after, as he often did these days. His familiar presence was a comforting reminder of how much my life had changed. He brought 2 glasses and a bottle of champagne, smiling as he set them down on the small table between us. "To freedom," he said, raising his glass. I laughed softly, clinking my glass against his. "To freedom," I echoed, the words feeling both light and powerful. We sipped in silence for a while, watching the stars. "You did it," Liam finally said, his tone thoughtful. "You stood up for yourself, reclaimed your life. I don't think I've ever seen someone handle a situation like this with so much strength." I turned to him, a faint smile on my lips. "There were moments when I didn't think I could," I admitted. "But every time I wanted to give up, I thought about what he did to me, how little he valued everything we had. And I realized I wasn't just fighting for revenge. I was fighting for myself." Liam reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. "And you won." The simplicity of his words struck me. I had won, not just against Jack, but against the fear, the self-doubt, and the temptation to stay silent. The Claire, who had once accepted Jack's excuses and swallowed her pain, was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned to stand tall, to demand more from life. As the night deepened, I felt a profound sense of closure. The chapter with Jack was over, and the future was mine to shape. There was no guarantee of what lay ahead, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. Under the stars, with Liam's warmth beside me and a new sense of purpose in my heart, I whispered to myself the words that had become my mantra. "I'm free." And I knew it was true. As I close this chapter, I want to thank you for walking through this journey with me. It wasn't easy, but it was transformative. Betrayal may have shattered my world, but it also gave me the strength to rebuild it. To anyone feeling lost or broken, know this: you are stronger than you think, and life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of something new. So here's to freedom, resilience, and the courage to move forward. Remember, you're never truly alone. Thank you, and take care.